All right, I think we can get going. Folks may jump in and join us as we go, but welcome everyone. My name is Katie Worthing and I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center in Yarmouth, Maine. I'm really happy to be hosting this program with Alyssa Toft of Quill Cue. I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce you to that fabulous service, and then we'll get talking about letters.
Good morning. Well, actually, good afternoon now. Katie, thank you so much for having me and agreeing to do this program. Like Katie said, my name is Alyssa Toft. I am the founder of Quill Cue, which is based in Minneapolis. Quill Cue shares a love for letter writing, which is what makes this such a great fit for this program. Quill Cue inspires you to do something simple but impactful, which is to send one handwritten note a month to someone who matters to you. So you sign up at quillandcue.com, and then each month you get a surprise kit. And it contains, well, the envelope looks like this, the outside envelope. But then inside your kit, you get a beautiful greeting card. We often work with different letterpress companies across the country. And then I include a stamp so that you have that handy, which is sometimes a big roadblock not to have that stamp. And then also something called a cue card. And what the cue card does is it gives you prompts about who to send your card to and what to say. So one month you might be encouraged to write to the hardest working person you know, or to someone who helped you through a difficult time, or to someone who helped you to take a leap of faith. So then you write your note. I'm just going to admit a few more people here. And you send it off. And then next month you get your next packet and another chance to make someone's day. And I'll drop a link in the chat if you'd like more information. Like I said, I'm so excited for today's event. Katie is a customer of Quill Cue, and in talking with her, I learned about her passion for letter writing, how her passion is kind of fed by getting to read letters in the archives of the museum. And I was just so intrigued by what she was telling me. And so I'm really excited that Katie agreed to do this program and teach us about what she's learned from these letters in the archives. What are some common themes? What makes a letter interesting? What should we do or not do when sending our own handwritten letters? And Katie, if there's anything that you can think of that would land our letter in a museum someday, I'd love your thoughts and tips on that. So again, thank you so much, Katie, and I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we can talk through these letters about what makes them so special and so easily kind of communicable over the decades. You know, a lot of these letters are 150 years old, and yet they still feel so fresh, and people are telling jokes that are still funny and stories that I still laugh at. So those are really timeless things. I'm just going to share my screen. We've got some great letters to take a look at here. All right, can everyone see that okay? All right. So yeah, it was really fun to prepare for this talk. I spent a long time thinking about which letters to choose, why I would choose those letters, what would make them interesting to people who are joining in on this talk. And it became really hard to narrow it down. I really had like, I don't know, a dozen letters in my head when I first started planning for this, and had to cut some of my favorites out of the talk to make sure we had time for them all. So it was tough, but I started thinking about, you know, what it was that made these letters my favorites. And this is really what this program is about. These are truly my favorite letters. They are not intended to be an even-handed survey of what's in our collection or, you know, an even story about history. This is just simply my favorite letters and my favorite correspondence. And as I started looking at these letters, a few themes emerged. And so I've matched a letter with each theme, but you'll see that a lot of the letters kind of pick up a number of these themes. So some letters are favorites simply because they were exciting to find in the collection. It was like an archival serendipity when I answered a question by finding a letter, and it just became this like perfect match. Some of them intersect with really major historical events, so we'll see some connecting to the Civil War, but they managed to also tell kind of some really mundane things that are kind of poignant against that big backdrop. Others offer a really interesting glimpse of a kind of, snippet of someone's life. You've got personalities, you've got gossip, you've got relationships encapsulated in these letters that are fascinating. Sometimes these are people that I just wish I could write to, back to 1880, this person seemed to write really great letters, and I kind of wish she was still around that, could send her a letter. She could write back, be fun. Others, as I mentioned, have these really funny, surprising, relatable stories or jokes even. And then the last theme here is some of these letters are just really rich visually. When you have artists writing letters, those artists decorate these letters, they add pictures, they are amazing works of art in addition to being great bits of news. So let's turn to the first one, which is my kind of, I guess if I had to pick a very favorite letter, it would be this next one I'm going to talk about, most exciting discovery. Before I get too far, I just want to mention that if anyone has questions, feel free to pipe in. There's a small group here, so I think we can do it that way. I'll also be happy to take questions at the end, either way, or you can put them in the chat box too. So thinking about this exciting discovery in the archives, sort of all starts with an invitation up into the attic of the First Baptist Church in Yarmouth. That photo there is my chair of my collections committee, Julie Benavides, who came with me, and we had been invited to come up and just collect archival materials, church records to add to our archive. This is something we do for a lot of the older organizations in town. And so this was sort of an ordinary day, but the pastor brought us up into the attic, and you can see just how packed that attic was. We spent some time going through trunks and boxes, and that trunk that Julie's sitting in front of, I remember kind of reaching down and finding down in the corner of it this little packet of folded paper tied up with twine. And I remember just thinking, this stuff looks old. I guess we should probably take this for the archive. It really was like a quick, simple decision. And you can actually see it in the lower left-hand corner of that photo, just this little narrow stack of letters on the corner of that bin. And so I brought them back, and this all happened in January 2020. Worldwide events conspired in the next few months, and it meant that I really didn't get a chance to look at these letters until later in the summer. And when I did, I realized that these letters had nothing to do with First Baptist Church. They were entirely in the wrong church attic. But what they contained was just an incredible archive of letters relating to excommunications from a different Yarmouth church. And as I was reading these letters, I realized that in this archive was a letter that sort of fulfilling a wish of a researcher that had contacted us probably the year before, looking for information on his ancestors who had been excommunicated from Yarmouth's First Parish Church. And he had always wondered what his ancestors were thinking, what was this process like for them. We had letters from the pastor who had kind of carried out the excommunication, but we did not have any information from the ancestors directly until I finally looked at these letters. And inside was a letter from this researcher's great-great-great-great-grandfather, James Hill, relating his feelings about his excommunication. Here it is in his handwriting with his signature, preserved for all these years in the wrong church attic. And so he's writing on Thursday, December 6, 1832, to Pastor David Shepley. He says, last evening I received your favor of the 3rd instant and perused it in, I hope, with proper feeling, and can truly say the more I reflect on the step which I have taken in letting out a part of my house for the purpose in which it is occupied, the more sorry I feel, and the more determined, after the close of the school, by the aid of divine grace, never to do it again, either for a dancing school, ball, or anything of the kind. And so in this letter, you get these details about why he was excommunicated. And it was really down to the fact that he had chosen to rent out part of his house as a dancing school. And that was totally against the church's wishes and feelings. And the pastor felt that it was egregious enough that James Hill would be excommunicated for this. And so this letter is this incredible document from James Hill himself saying, I'm kind of sorry I did this. I don't totally think it's a sin, but I understand that it's injured the church. But he's like, he apologizes, but he's sort of like, I'm not going to stop. Like I've entered into this contract and we're just going to go with this, which is just fascinating. And so the researcher, the descendant of James Hill, to whom I sent this almost as, immediately after finding it, was just like floored that here finally were his ancestors' thoughts about his actions, his choice to rent out the house for the dancing school, and his sort of acceptance that like this would mean excommunication from the church. And he was like, sorry, but sort of okay with it at the same time, which was amazing. So to have this letter in the wrong attic come up at the time that I was kind of looking for more information on this person was sort of a remarkable coincidence. Really pretty incredible. And I'll just go back to the last image so you can see the gravestone is kind of a third part of the story. That's the Hill family stone here in Yarmouth that had recently collapsed. And so we had this letter, we had this genealogist who was looking for information, and then another person became involved who ended up repairing the stone. So this wonderful kind of confluence of events.
Katie, I'm sorry I missed this, but you said it was a relative who was actually specifically trying to find out if this ancestor had been excommunicated from the church and for what reason?
Yeah, he knew that he had been excommunicated, and he knew that there was a dancing school, but he always like wanted to know more. Like, how did he feel about this? Because we only really had the other side of the story. We only had the pastor's point of view saying, these people have been sinning and this is terrible and we can't have this as, a member of our church undertaking these activities. And so this letter kind of answered this. I mean, we never get to do this, like to have such an obscure question and to find a letter that answered it was incredible.
Yeah, that is like very specific, right? And like very on point. That's amazing.
Yeah, when I picked up that letter and opened it and started reading it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is the letter that my researcher who's out in Oklahoma, this is what he'd been looking for. It was just incredible. And the other interesting piece of this is that the researcher, the descendant of the Hill family, has kind of done some research into what was going on with James Hill's family at this time before he rented the house out for the dancing school, and found that James Hill and his wife had lost 6 of their children in the past maybe 5 years before this point to tuberculosis. And so the genealogist sort of figures that, this was James Hill's effort to kind of bring some joy back into his house for his one remaining youngest daughter, so that she could, enjoy something and just be joyful in the house again. All right, so moving on to my next theme here. These are letters that are kind of written against big events, but that communicate really poignant details, relatable details against this, the sort of drama of national history. And so we'll talk a little bit about Dr. James Bates, who is one of 3 generations of physicians to practice in Yarmouth. He served as a surgeon during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865 and was stationed down on Ship Island, Mississippi in the early years of the war. And Ship Island is a pretty small, pretty desolate barrier island, 12 miles off the coast of Mississippi. Confederates had abandoned it in September of 1861. The Union had held it since then. And it was seen as this kind of strategically important location because from Ship Island, you could conceivably mount attacks on Mobile, on New Orleans, on Texas, and so kind of keeping people guessing in a sense. And so it was really sort of an important location. And so Dr. Bates was sent down to Ship Island as a surgeon, and we have his family archive in our collection. And a lot of his materials they're pretty clinical. It's reports of, examining soldiers, and it's accounts of expenses and descriptions of equipment and stuff. It's not, it's interesting, but it's not real personal in some ways. But we do have just a handful of letters that Dr. Bates wrote to his kids back home in Yarmouth. And this is absolutely one of my favorite letters. He's writing it from Ship Island on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1862. And I'll just read it to you so you can appreciate the whole thing. He says, "My dear little Lottie, I wish you a Merry Christmas. I hope you will have a very nice time today and be a very good little girl. Did you hang up your stocking last night? And what did Santa Claus put into it? I hope you'll get something very nice to eat. I guess he'll put in some candy. I sent you the gold necklace for a Christmas present. I hope you will like it. How does it fit your neck? I hope you're a good little girl and mind mother, and that you are kind to your little brothers. When you have candy or anything that's good, you must give Eddie and Georgie some. I shall write you again soon, and you must ask mother to write me for you. I should be very glad to have a letter from my little Lottie. I shall come home to see you all as soon as I can. I want to see you very much. Your dear father." And I mean, I think it's sort of self-explanatory, just what a like precious letter that is. Here's this doctor who is serving in, this cataclysmic civil war. He's dealing with, injured soldiers, no doubt, sickness and disease. And yet here he is, writing a pretty normal, modern sounding Christmas letter to his little girl back at home. He's asking about Santa and her stocking and her Christmas presents. And it's just so sweet and poignant. And we have a couple other letters he wrote to Lottie and her brothers. And they are all just this, kind of infused with this wish that he could get home and see them as soon as he can. He did make it home. He was honorably discharged in 1865, but unfortunately, and that's where this sort of gains a little bit more poignancy, Lottie died in 1867 at the age of 10. So she, didn't live to adulthood, and we have just these letters kind of surviving of their relationship, her relationship with her father. Her two brothers did live to adulthood, and a younger sister did too. Her brother Georgie in this letter is the one who becomes a physician himself. So he kind of carries on the family tradition of practicing medicine. So Yarmouth, for those who might not be that familiar with it, has a long history of shipbuilding. So a lot of our letters in our collection relate to ship captains, shipbuilders, the sort of business of shipping in the 19th century. And a lot of times those are kind of one-sided. You're just getting the letters from the captain who's dealing with freight and cost of doing business and insurance and things like that. But sometimes we get lucky and have a couple different sides or aspects of the correspondence. And that's the case in this next group of letters that I'm going to share from the Brown family. This is Captain John Fulton Brown's ship called the Alice D. Cooper. This is painted on glass, and this was a ship portrait done while the ship was in port in India, and it's now in the collection of the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath. So looking at the Brown family, Captain John Fulton Brown was the second generation seafarer. He came from a really long line of Yarmouth residents. His family had maintained a farm and a homestead on Brown's Point in Yarmouth. And in fact, it was really only until the last couple years that they had maintained a presence there. Last surviving member of the family passed away not too long ago, but an incredibly long-standing Yarmouth family. And Captain Brown had 6 children with his wife, Abby, but really spent most of the years in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s traveling from port to port, shipping cargo around the world. And we have a lot of Mary's letters to John. I should point out her name is legally Mary, but she goes by Abby. So I use both interchangeably because she seems to do that too. A lot of letters from her to him. Sometimes she includes letters from the children. And we have a couple of letters from him back to her. And so it's really interesting to see how she's dealing with his absence and how he's dealing with his own kind of distance from his family, I guess. So looking at Mary's letter here, she's writing this in my notes, right? In 1879, Yarmouth, September 8th, 1879. And she's writing him, I don't remember where he is at this point, but I think he's on his way to India, although he might not be quite there just yet. So she says, "My darling husband, I'll now write you the second time, and every time I write, I think you are so much nearer your destination, and I hope you will get there by the time this does. We are all well as usual and hope you are, darling. You don't know how fast Edmund grows. He walks around by the chairs and wants to stand on his feet all the time. He's fast asleep now, a little darling. His hair curls all around his head, and he is good all the time when his teeth don't plague him. He's not got but one tooth yet, but I can see more coming and hope they will get through before long. The girls are well and are going to school next Monday. The schoolhouse looks real nice, and I'm glad we've got one, ain't you? We're getting along nicely. We've got a splendid piece of corn and beans and some of the best potatoes we've had since we've been here. And she goes on, and this letter is just packed with information about the farm, the livestock, the mortgage, the finances, the local news, the town meeting, how the kids are growing, who's pregnant in town, who might be pregnant in town, and the new horse that she's got, how much she had to pay for him, how much they got for the old horse. It's just amazing the amount of detail that she crams into this letter. And you can see she uses 4 pages and then comes back and uses the top of this first page, writing sideways to kind of finish her letter. So it is just jam-packed with information. And what it conveys to me is just how busy Mary is while her husband is at sea. She is taking care of everything. She's got a baby, she's got 2 girls who are in school, all of these things are happening, and she is just running the household. No doubt it was an immense amount of work, and yet she sort of just handles it pretty effortlessly, it seems.
Katie, with the just with the letters that you've shown on screen, the handwriting is so beautiful. I mean, men, women, it doesn't seem to matter. Like, everyone's penmanship is so incredible. Is that sort of what you see across the board, or do you sometimes run into letters where you can't read the penmanship and then you need to get help from an expert?
Yes, and Mary has a really nice handwriting. We have a lot of her letters, and like once you read a few, you get a little bit more into like how this person writes and how they might spell words that aren't standard English spellings today. But other people, like for example, in the first letter I showed, the James Hill letter, his handwriting was fine, but we have a lot of letters from the pastor who was doing the excommunication, and his handwriting is really hard to decipher. So it takes a lot of time to kind of go through these, try to transcribe them, go back through, reread. Sometimes I'll take a picture on my phone, blow it up, zoom in, change the contrast. You can kind of play around with the photographic qualities that way, and sometimes that gives clues. Sometimes I just put it away and ignore it for a while and try again like a week later or something. I've also asked, all of my coworkers here, we all share these these questions, and even my husband weighs in on some of them sometimes too.
Yeah, you've definitely come up with a lot of techniques there.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, the quality of paper that they were using in the 19th century at this point is really high. So these letters are incredibly good condition for the most part. And even some of the ones that we have from the 18th century are really sound. Obviously we're handling them in archivally appropriate ways, but they're going to last versus some of the 20th century letters. People aren't using as nice a quality paper. There's acid in it, and those can be really hard to handle sometimes.
Interesting.
All right. So also with the Brown family, sometimes Mary tucks in a letter from one of the kids in the package to her husband, which I love. And so this is one from Hattie Brown, who writes in December 1879, "Dear Papa, I thought I would write to you. Are you well today? The other day, Bert brought in the horse blanket to mend it, and Edmund got down on it on all fours and tried to kick up with both feet, and he found that he could not do it, so he kicked up with one foot and kicked Bert in the face. I had a gold chain for Christmas, and I will tell you the rest of the things that I had. A pair of bracelets, and Martha has got a pair. Blanche has a gold ring. Eddie had a jumping jack, and Mother had a fish platter. I cannot think of anything else to say, so I will sign my name." And then you can see on that second page there, she signs her name, but then fills in the rest with doodles and just kind of gibberish letters. She's clearly still practicing her penmanship on this one. And I just think it's charming. She's learning how to write a letter. She's telling a funny story about Bert, who helps him out on the farm. he's mending the blanket, and Edmund the baby is playing around. And I love the sort of list of Christmas things, the things you got for Christmas. This is like so timeless in a sense. This is, what you might text or send someone today. And here she is writing it to her dad in 1879.
And I love how she just calls it out. I have nothing more to tell you. So
right,
I'm
that's
done.
it.
I'm sending my name.
And the other side of this, she's made an effort to, like, she's made a second attempt to start the letter and just given up. And the rest of the letter is just filled with these little scribbly lines and practice numbers and letters. And then the kind of third piece of the Brown family correspondence is John Brown writing back to Mary in Yarmouth. And so John Brown here, this is a little bit later, this is 1894, which is proof that John Brown is traveling the world for years. Kids are growing at home, Mary's taking care of things back at home, and he is still working really hard. So this letter is dated from Hobson's Bay, which is near Melbourne in Australia, 1894, December 29th, again, kind of Christmas letter. But he says, "My darling wife, we've got started on the road home at last. We're now towing down the bay with a pilot on board. How I long to see you, darling, and the children. It seems ages since I left you. Pray for me, dear. We have a long, dreary voyage. Kiss all for me. I hope you will not freeze this winter. How I wish I was with you to keep you warm." And then he adds on in December 30th, "Darling, it's 6 a.m. and the tug has just come back to tow us out. We're going by Queenscliff. It is a pretty place ashore here, but how I long to see home. There's no place like it in this world. I hope we shall soon be out of debt so that I won't have to leave you. I hope we shall be in Boston in 100 days, and we ought to if we have a chance. That will be about the 10th of April. A long farewell to you, darling, and may God bless you and the children. Your true and loving husband, J.F. Brown." This is a long letter. This is about 6 pages. So I've just provided the first and second page here and kind of distilled down his just like really palpable loneliness. He is really desperate to get home. And when he says, "I'll see you in 100 days," it's just the length of that voyage is kind of hard to fathom, really, that he's leaving Australia and he's like, "Well, maybe in April, I'll see you and I'll get your next letter." So it's I think so poignant too to think about their correspondence. Mary's writing to him, he's writing back to her when he can, and there are these gaps in their communication. I mean, mail could move pretty quickly, but if you were a moving target, it's hard to get news back and forth. And so, we have other couples, other seafaring couples who are writing to each other, and at a certain point, like the captain might die and the wife doesn't get that news until after she sent a couple letters and finally receives the bad news. So there's this constant like worry and doubt about when they'll see each other and be able to communicate again.
How did people send letters to a ship? I mean, did the ship have an address? I mean, how did that actually work?
So you might, a lot of captains will tell their correspondents to send it to their next port. Like, I'll be in, Bombay in April, and so you can send it to me there. And it would go via, various services. I'll show you in a minute, one that would go by a special post to India. Other times they'd be taken by other vessels. So you might, if you are in port with a vessel that's going back to New York, you might give your letters to them and they can mail them when they're back in port, something like that. But it was, I think they kind of moved letters the best they could in lots of different ways. But it would vary from ship to ship and era to era too.
Wow.
So John Brown makes it home. He does finally retire. He's another theme of their letters is this constant worry about money and when he can stop doing this job, because he really wants to get home to his farm. And I think not long after this voyage, he's able to, because when you look at census records going forward, he, previously had been listed as a shipmaster, and then after this, he's listed as a farmer. So I think he's able to kind of achieve his retirement from this point forward. So I've got one more letter connected to the Brown family, but it's someone that fulfills another of my themes, which is really good pen pal potential. Like, this is someone, she's writing in the 1880s, but gosh, she writes good letters. And I really wish she could write some more of them because she's just a great letter writer. And the person who's writing these letters is Captain John Brown's cousin, Addie Washburn. Her name officially is Addie Brown Reed Washburn. And she is a really fascinating person. She's marrying into this Washburn family of Livermore, Maine. And they are incredible. Some of you out in the Midwest probably have heard of some of the members of the Washburn family, but Israel and Martha Washburn had 10 children, and many of them just left the state. So among those 10 children, we had one who was the governor of Maine, one who founded a bank here in Maine, another who was the U.S. House representative and a minister to France. Cadwallader Washburn was the governor of Wisconsin and a founder of the company that became Gold Medal Flour. Let's see, another brother was a member of the gold rush. He went out to California, was in the gold rush, and used his money to fund his newspaper career, and then became minister of Paraguay. Another brother founded the flour mill that became Pillsbury, and was a politician in Minnesota. That's William Washburn. And then one went to sea, and that's the one that concerns us. His name was Samuel, and he came home and married Addie and lived in the family homestead in Livermore. So he was sort of like the anchor back home to Maine, where all of these other brothers had just kind of traveled the country and had these fabulous careers. Samuel was injured in the Civil War and came home and managed the homestead. And his second wife, Addie, writes these fabulous letters to Captain Brown as he's traveling the world. And this is really one of my favorites. She's writing in November 1880. She says, "My dear cousin, your last letter from Cardiff told me to write about the 10th of November. It is now the 7th. I wonder where you are today, on the mighty deep without any doubt. Wish that I knew you were safe on the land. I tremble almost when I think of the water, but perhaps you could get used to it like others before me. We are feeling mighty good here in Maine. Our presidential election came off last Tuesday, and a glorious one it was too. Garfield is elected by an overwhelming majority. Of course, you do not get so excited over politics as you would if you were on the land and in the midst of the excitement, but I trust that you take enough interest in it to want our country ruled by honest men. I am quite a politician and take great interest, for I think that every woman and child ought to have an interest in their own country, especially such times as these." And I think, it goes without saying, that she's talking about themes that are very relatable to today, the sort of feeling of, of course we want, the best for our politicians. And she's thinking about an election that was kind of controversial in 1880. So a lot of that's really relatable. But I love her sentiment about being a woman, really wanting to be involved and part of this discussion. And she goes on and spends a lot of the rest of the letter talking about the weather, which sounds boring, but she's able to make it interesting. It's a delightful rain. It's been so dry. She's worrying about people going into winter in such dry conditions. She's talking about family coming to visit. She talks about her 4-year-old daughter and how she's really good at spelling and, learning to read really quickly and feeding the chickens and the kittens. And then she closes it with a really wonderful statement. She says, "I hope the next time I hear from you, it will be that you are coming home and give up going to sea. I know you must be tired of such a life. Write as soon as you receive this and tell me what your plans are. Your wife has more grit than I to live alone so much. I could not stand it." And so it's another kind of glimpse of this relationship between Addie and her cousin John, but also John and his wife Mary. And she clearly admires Mary for being able to just deal with these really challenging conditions pretty constantly. And then here's just the envelope that letter was in, and you can see how she's addressed it. So Captain John F. Brown, ship Alice D. Cooper, so you just write the name of the ship there, Bombay, Asia, via Suez Canal. And that's what it took to get that letter from South Livermore, Maine, all the way to India.
Actually incredible that it arrived, right? I mean,
yeah.
When you think about that, that's amazing.
Yep. And she's mailed it November 8th. And then on the back of the envelope is an interesting stamp from the Sea Post Office, which I think is 2nd of December, It's gone via Italy to get to that point. But the Sea Post Office was a service that was set up. They would run steamers through the Suez Canal to improve mail delivery to India. So she's kind of hooking up to this modern service to get this to him. Yeah. And he's answered it. You can see his handwriting up there in pencil. We don't have his letter to her, but you know, it's clear he's keeping up with his correspondence. So another theme that comes through, and all of these letter writers really relate amazing stories in their letters, but perhaps none with such gusto as Edward Thaxter, who's here on the left-hand side. And he was an artist in Yarmouth, this really promising, youthful sculptor who grew up in town and had an opportunity to go to Italy to study sculpture. He went there, he's traveling around, he's learning from the masters, he is setting up a studio, taking commissions, he's like starting his career there. And he carries on this correspondence with a friend back home, Leila Small, who's in the center picture. She is also an artist. We have a number of her portrait sketches and paintings in our collection, quite accomplished in her own right, but I think did not have the opportunities that Edward did to get to Italy to further her career. And so Edward's kind of writing back to her these incredible letters of his time in Italy. And I've included here, just on the right-hand side, an image of his sculpture that's in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Make Merrilies. And you can just see the emotion and the drama that he's kind of put into this sculpture. It's incredible. Unfortunately, Edward, despite making plans to come back to Yarmouth for a visit home, didn't make it. He died in 1881, quite sadly, really at the beginning of this incredible career. But his letters live on. And so we've got this one from August 13th, 1880, where he's based in Florence, but he's decided to go to Venice for a few days. And he writes to Leila, "Dear Leila, is this a dream, or is it really true that I'm here in this beautiful city called the Pride of the Sea? If it is, oh, do not awake me, but let me dream again. P.S. Carlton has stuck a whole paper of pins into my side, and I find that I'm here, feet and all. We met two lady friends by accident of ours from Florence. They're here on vacation, and as we are all artists, we enjoy our moonlight excursions in the gondolas very much. Wish you could be one of us. We have such splendid times playing on the guitar and singing. Don't you think it's romantic? We saw and stood on the Bridge of Sighs, and as the back of the guard was turned, I got a piece of plastering, which I will save for you." And so just his enthusiasm to be in this place is just so wonderful. You can just kind of feel it through the decades that separate us. And what's so wonderful about this letter too, in addition to his just like expressive, effusive writing, is that he's pasted in these tiny little photos on the second page so that Leila can see, you know, what he's seeing. And so he says, "And now, Leila, I will give you a small art gallery for a cent. Will not stop to explain, but only write their names under each." He says, the man on the left, "This is a man with a bad eye who sells candy in the street." In the middle, "This is the Grand Canal, which runs through the city the way Royals River runs through Yarmouth." That's our local river here in town. Below that, "This is a beautiful church near our hotel." And then on the right-hand side, "These are fruit sellers who are very funny people." The end. And he talks a little bit about not being sure when he's going to head back to Florence. He's kind of feeling tired and enjoying this vacation. But Edward's someone who is just, as I said, effusive in his descriptions of Italy and includes these photos. He includes little sketches sometimes that just enliven what he's telling Leila. And I think he's also, trying to share this experience with her. He does often express his wish that she could come join him there. And then our last letter here is another one with great visuals. As I said, artists write amazing letters. And this is Edith Whiting Yaffe, who is another artist in town here. She was born in Sweden, and her family immigrated to the US in the early 20th century and ended up coming to Maine, finding one of Yarmouth's islands, Cousins Island, and buying some property on it that they built a summer house on. And this was, as I mentioned, in the early 20th century. So there was no bridge to the mainland from Cousins at that point. And so it was kind of hard to get to. But this family, her family just embraced this place, loved it. And she ended up moving to the island full time and living there, winters and all, through the middle 20th century. So much of her time on the island was spent before the bridge to the mainland was built, which means it was a pretty lonely place to live in the winter. There weren't a lot of people who were there full time year round as she was. But I love this picture. Here she is in her studio. I assume this is on Cousins. And she's got her bean boots on. You can see them just under the stool there. So she's well equipped for a Maine winter. All of her supplies are there. And she's just kind of embracing island living. And she's someone who was just incredibly adventurous during her lifetime. She skied in the Alps and traveled a lot and painted portraits for people. She was a really accomplished artist. And on Cousins continued this adventurous lifestyle. She would wait until the bay would freeze over and then ski from the island to other islands or to the mainland. So just incredible daring and ability there for Edith. So her letter here, you moved into the 20th century with this one. This is 1954. And she's writing to a friend in Boston who has a small cottage on Little John Island, which is another of Yarmouth's islands. And there is a bridge connecting Cousins to Little John. And she writes, "Dear Lou, started to write the Garden Digest pages first, but I guess I'd better switch to letter. Lucky your letter came today. I was about to declare you dead and gone and begin to carry off the house. But instead, on receiving your nice letter, I bought you some more plants." Picklepuss, Doodlebug, and Patsy trailed along. Patsy had never been across the bridge before. And so here she is, like, writing this sketch of her and 3 of her cats. She notoriously had quite a number of cats in her house on Cousins, crossing the bridge over to Little John's Island. And she's got her supplies and I think plant pots and things. And the cats are joining her along for the trek. She tucked in this little sketch of Picklepuss here, having caught a squirrel. And this was just tucked into the letter, just a beautiful watercolor. And I think just her quick sketches convey such humor and life and motion, and they're really just wonderful aspects of the letter. But she continues on the second page. November storm brewing. My trip to Chebigue, which is another nearby island, proved one of the most hazardous and strenuous ones. Had all I could do to make it both ways, and on the home stretch, couldn't get beyond Dickerman's Beach. So next day, had to retrieve boat, went there on skis. Then afterwards, we got a blizzard, then rain and thunder and gale winds. This morning, 2 degrees and more snow coming. And then the rest of the letter is about the plants that she's got in her window garden. And I think she must be taking care of her friends' plants too. But you can see in the sketch down below, the ever-present cats. And here she is digging out from this storm, which is just an amazing little sketch. And it just speaks to the difficulty of living on Cousins Island at this point. You know, even getting to Chebigue Island, which would have been her main contact point for mail and groceries, that's tough to get there. And I just
I was surprised how vibrant the watercolor still is. Where did you find this letter? How, like, was it again just the quality of the stationery that really preserved that color so well, or do you have any information about that?
Yeah, so this was donated back in the 80s. So I don't know off the top of my head quite how it was preserved. Obviously, it's been kept really well. I think because she was such a well-known artist, people tend to preserve her works no matter what form they take. But the little painting of Picklepuss there is definitely on nice watercolor paper. The letter is on pretty solid stationery too, from the looks of it. And so part of it's just luck that it came to us in this condition, and we work as hard as we can to make sure it stays this way.
Wow.
And I suspect part of it also too is because she's using good quality inks and paints, and you know, that's helping to assist the preservation too. I brought her envelope. You can see she's mailed this from Chebigue Island in February, so she would have had to trek it over there. I think she's taking her boat over to the island. not skiing at this point, but you can see on the back of the envelope, she wrote delayed by storm. So, just like she couldn't quite get the letter in the mail as soon as she wanted, just because the weather was so hard. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to take questions. I can go back to any of these. Please feel free to ask away.
Well, I know I have some questions, so I can maybe kick us off and others can join in if they.
Whoops, did we lose Alyssa? Let's see if she pops back up. Any questions from anyone else?
This is John. I'm just interested, in addition to letters, do you have any diaries that follow the same thing as family or individual over time, whether it's day-to-day events of life or shipboard logs of what was going on?
Yeah, we do. We have a number of diaries and ship logs and things like that. And it's funny, diaries can be, they're hit or miss sometimes. Sometimes someone's diary is just like, got up at 5 a.m., weather fine, and that's it. Like if you're interested in meteorological facts, they can be kind of fascinating, but other folks are much richer in what they put in their diaries, and it becomes kind of a letter form for them too. So I'm thinking of, others that discuss, outings with school friends and graduation from high school and things like that, where they go into much more detail and they're more narrative. And those are just gems, really wonderful to read and think about.
That's great. Yeah. It's a wonderful selection you picked for this program.
Well, thanks. It was hard. It was really hard.
Yeah, I love your programs.
Thanks.
Do you only accept letters that you can sort of verify were written by Yarmouth residents, or what's the scope of written, letters that you accept?
Yeah, so all of our collections policy really states that anything we have should relate to Yarmouth in one way or another. So we really try to keep the focus on that. I would say most of our letters were either written by or to Yarmouth people. So that's the kind of unifying theme. But not all of them contain Yarmouth news, like Addie's letter from Livermore. She's writing to a Yarmouth person, but she's giving us news about presidential politics, just like Livermore local news, all kinds of stuff woven in there. And I think it's just sort of like lucky that she's writing to a Yarmouth person, because then we get to keep it and enjoy it as part of our collection.
Do you have people calling you saying, hey, I found, sort of like the stack of letters you found in the church attic? Is that how these letters come to you, by residents, clearing out homes and finding them, or what's that process like?
Yeah, a lot of times it is. People will stop in. I mean, like one of the things I say about this job is you never really know what's going to walk in the door. And that's true, because people come in with amazing things sometimes. I always prefer it when they call ahead to give us a little warning, but like maybe a couple of years ago, all of those Brown letters came into the collection from a local family who had just had them. I think they had some, as part of their family tree, and recognized that they deserved to be preserved and shared with the public, and so brought them in and donated them, which was really great. So yeah, some people will just bring them in. We have made some purchases in the past, and I don't know that any of the ones I shared were purchases. They probably were all donated by local families who had these incredible collections and donated them.
Have you ever discovered any missing links or shocking information from a letter that kind of had you rewrite something you thought you knew?
Well, I think that Hill letter is a great example of that was a missing link that I just, I had been in contact with the researcher. We stay in touch, and he was sort of like, I really have these questions I'd love to know. And I was sort of like, Craig, we're never gonna know that, this is wishful thinking. And then sure enough, there it was. We had that answer for him.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't able to join right at the beginning of the call. So I missed that part. I'll have to rewatch it.
Yeah, that's okay. But there are other letters that either force you to maybe not rewrite, but reconsider how people were, living in Yarmouth. I think Mary Brown's letters helped me understand just how I don't know, busy and capable and multi-talented she was. And I sort of, you always knew that about captains' wives, but to see it listed out in those letters really makes you reconsider, just what she was taking care of in his absence. And then there are really funny ones, someone brought in, this is not one in our collection, unfortunately, but someone brought it in to show me, and it's essentially like a breakup letter. It's, dear so-and-so, this is just not going to work. I'm so sorry. I hope you're happy with someone else, and it's 130 years old, right? And so some of these things are sort of timeless, and it's nice to have that reminder that, like, people are still people, we communicate the same sentiments and the same ideas, sometimes even in the same ways over decades.
Yeah, I was
sharing.
It was interesting in Addie's letter, just some of the ways that she was describing that election, and that some of the phrases that were used then are similar to some of the phrases that we use now. It's really fascinating. And even I think one of the words that you said, can't remember which letter it was, but using the word grit. And I guess I thought maybe grit was sort of, in sort of our modern lexicon, but not necessarily a word that went back that far, but that they were talking about grit back then. That was interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. Like, sometimes you'll see these words and letters and think, oh, I didn't think people use that, or
Yeah.
just that, someone might spell a word wrong. And I think there's this idea that, if someone's writing in the 19th century and they've got this beautiful penmanship, of course they know how to spell every word correct. But, it was flexible. They were spelling words. They communicated nonetheless. It may not be how we spell them now, but it's interesting to think about those flexibilities. And when people, use kind of vulgar terms and swear words and stuff, those end up in these letters sometimes too. And sometimes they won't write them out fully, like D-N, right? Instead of writing gam, or S-T. And other times they just write them out.
Really good.
Well, Katie, another question I had for you was, you've reviewed so many letters, and I know you said it was hard to even narrow down for today's program, but what makes a letter really compelling and interesting? You talked about, a lot of them talk about the weather. I assume that's maybe not the most interesting topic to be talking about in a letter. I don't know, but I'd love to get your take on, hey, like, these are the ones that really draw me in and that are timeless. And maybe those are some tips that we can use when we're writing our own handwritten letters.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people do talk about the weather, and I think that's okay. Like, Addie can talk about the weather, but she's not just saying it's raining, but like, the rain is such a welcome guest after all of these dry weeks that we've had. I mean, the way she phrases it just makes it that much more interesting and engaging. And then, we have another letter that I considered for this talk where someone's talking about a tornado that came through, and, how unusual that was. And I think even that, like, yeah, it's the weather, and that's sort of kind of our constant topic of conversation, but a lot of these letter writers have just a hook or a different perspective that makes it so compelling and interesting. And I think, even with mundane news, like, what did you get for Christmas? Like, that might be interesting. The way someone phrases it makes it interesting. And then the space of, 150 years kind of adds to the interest too. So I guess I would say, like, I don't know, for my letters, if I think I'm writing an interesting letter now, hopefully in 100 years, someone else will say, hey, that's a cool letter, who knows?
Do you save all your letters?
I don't. So, like, whoever, like, I've written to, hopefully they're saving the letters. And, I think it's interesting to think about so much of our correspondence being digital. And, like, I don't know, I think that's the job of someone in 100 years to figure out how to access and preserve and make sense of that collection. But hopefully also we've got paper letters just in case, that preservation doesn't happen and people can't read, our mundane, boring emails from 2022. That I save your letters, make sure they get someplace interesting at the end of the day.
That is something that when I was thinking about this program today, thinking about what are given the prevalence of texting and emailing, what does the future hold for the display and preservation of written communications if it's not, physical? I mean, are people going to be taking screenshots of text message exchanges, and will those be displayed in a museum, or are we just really going to be losing a vast amount of correspondence about our times right now because you're not printing out emails most likely and, sort of archiving those?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And right, like I think about it a lot, like how are we preserving this for the future? And I know right now, like I've preserved my emails and I have this record of work I've done here. And like I said, I think cross my fingers that in 50 years, that information is still accessible to whoever's in this job. But in some ways, I think that'll make whatever we write down now that much more valuable, because it will be sort of a tangible object that we won't have to kind of access digitally. But I also think that future archivists will be clever enough to know how to collect our text messages into something that can provide value and interest. I think to some of our postcard collection here, which are, quick little letters, a lot of those are like text messages. See you on the 9 o'clock train, like that's all it is. And so I'd like to think that, yeah, whoever is dealing with my text messages in 50 years, they'll have figured it out.
Yeah.
We were taking care of our 13-year-old grandson, and when you were talking about how beautiful the handwriting is and the cursive, it is so beautiful in a lot of those letters. And I was talking to my grandson about that, and he said, I told him, I'll write you a letter. And he said, well, don't write it in cursive, Grandma, because I won't be able to read it. And I said, well, you better learn to read cursive, because I'm going to write to you in college and you better be able to read my letters. So that's kind of interesting that their handwriting was so beautiful. And I don't quite understand why we're not teaching cursive to these kids these days.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, that's a great point. And we have, I work with a lot of high school students and college interns, and not all of them come in being able to read cursive. And so, that's part of what we work on, of like, okay, you're going to like work your way through this letter. But I think it's hard if you haven't learned it to try to read it too. So it's absolutely a skill that future archivists will need to cultivate or develop one way or another. I do have a colleague who teaches at the university here in University of Southern Maine, and I think she's added a portion of kind of cursive literacy to her college classes so that kids will have better fluency with it.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. This was such a joy. Every email that I've been sending to Katie has been, I'm so excited about this. I can't wait. And I really mean it. Like, this was fascinating. Not something that most of us have access to. And just the way that you put the information together for us was really, I don't know, it was really fascinating. And I really appreciate everything that you did to make this such a great program for us.
Well, thanks. And thanks everyone for attending, and great questions. And I really had a great time putting this together. I love talking about our collection and particularly letters. So it was fun.
Great program.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right.
Thank you.